At my dad's while reading, my stepmother sat in black, smirking like she'd already won and buried me years ago. Then the lawyer read my name, closed the folder, reached for a locked metal box beneath the table, and calmly told everyone not to leave their seats. I was 29 years old the day I watched my stepmother smile at my father's while reading as if she'd already won. If you had told me when I was a kid that one day I'd be sitting across from her in a mahogany-paneled conference room, listening to a lawyer recite legal jargon about estate distribution and beneficiaries, I would have laughed. Back then, I thought my family was unbreakable. I thought my dad would always be my hero. My name is Daniel Walker. I'm the oldest son of Thomas Walker, who spent 3 decades turning a single used car lot on the edge of town into one of the largest auto dealerships in the state. Around here, people either bought a car from Tom Walker or they wanted to. His face was on billboards, on the little paper plates they stuck where the license plate should go. To most of the town, he was a success story. To me, when I was little, he was just Dad, the guy who taught me how to ride a bike in the cracked asphalt lot behind the showroom, who let me sit on his lap and steer cars around when the place was closed. But that was before everything changed. Before my mother died. Before Linda, my mom, Sarah, passed away when I was 14. Brain aneurysm. One minute she was in the kitchen yelling at me to turn my music down. The next minute she was on the floor, and my world cracked open with the sound of the paramedics pounding on our front door. After the funeral, the house felt hollow. My dad tried to keep things together. He'd make burnt grilled cheese sandwiches and sit with me in the dark living room, the TV flickering on mute. He'd squeeze my shoulder and say, "It's just you and me now, kiddo. We're gonna be okay." For a while, I believed him. Then, about a year later, Linda came into the picture. She started out as the new office manager at the dealership. I remember the first time I saw her. I'd biked over after school, sweaty and out of breath, and there she was behind the glass front desk, blonde hair perfectly curled, French manicure tapping on the keyboard, perfume so strong it made my head spin. She gave me this sugary smile and said, "You must be Danny. Your dad talks about you all the time." At home that night, Dad couldn't stop mentioning her. "She's a real professional. Organized. Sharp as a tack," he said, shoveling takeout into his mouth. "You should have seen how she handled the inventory mess." A few months later, she wasn't just handling inventory. She was sitting at our dinner table. Then she was bringing over homemade casseroles. Then her overnight bag was quietly living in the downstairs closet. By the time I turned 16, Linda had moved in officially. And with her came Ethan. Ethan was her son from a previous relationship. He was 12 when they moved in together, all bony elbows and shaggy hair. At first, I tried to be nice. It wasn't his fault our lives were being rearranged. We played video games together. I showed him where the best shortcut was to get to the park. But from day one, there was a difference in the way my dad looked at the two of us. With me, his tone had grown clipped, impatient. "You need to help more around here, Dan. You're almost a man, not a guest." With Ethan, he softened. "Don't worry about it, buddy. Danny'll show you how." When Ethan got a B on a science test, there was a little celebration. When I brought home straight A's, Dad barely glanced at the report card. "That's what I expect from you," he said. Linda encouraged the gap. At first, it was subtle. "Tom, you pushed Daniel so hard," she'd murmur, hand on my father's arm. "Let him breathe." Then, when I didn't do something exactly the way she wanted, I'd hear her in the kitchen whispering, "He's just difficult. Still hasn't processed losing Sarah, bless him." I was difficult when I bristled at Ethan being given my room because he's younger and needs more space. I was ungrateful when I questioned why Ethan got a brand new mountain bike for his 13th birthday and I got a used laptop for school that I'd already paid half of with my part-time job money. When I spoke up, Linda's eyes would go glassy with fake tears. "I'm trying so hard to be a good stepmother," she'd say. "I just don't know what else to do." The more she tried, the more my dad pulled away from me. By the time I was 18, the house that had once been our home felt like it belonged entirely to Linda and her golden boy. The pictures on the mantle were mostly of the three of them. Family vacation in Florida, Ethan's soccer trophies, Christmas morning with Linda in matching pajamas with my dad and Ethan. My mother's framed photo had migrated from the center of the shelf to a dusty corner in the hallway. The final break came on a rainy evening in October of my senior year. I'd been accepted to a state college 2 hours away and had been quietly saving every paycheck from the dealership's wash bay, where I'd been working weekends and summers. I'd assumed, stupidly, that Dad would help some. After all, he'd been talking for years about sending my boy to college. That night at dinner, I brought it up. "So, I got the financial aid package," I said, heart pounding. "There's still a gap, but if you can help with tuition, I can cover books and rent with my job." Linda and Ethan were sitting at the table with us. Ethan was scrolling his phone, half listening. Dad didn't meet my eyes. He cleared his throat. "About that, Dan. We need to have a talk." The way he said, "we" made my stomach drop. Linda dabbed her lips with her napkin. "Daniel, your father and I have been going over the family finances. With the business expansion and other obligations, we're not in a position to fund your little adventure right now." "Adventure?" I repeated. "It's college." "Our college," Ethan muttered under his breath, then smirked when he saw my look. My father sighed. "You're an adult now. When I was your age, no one gave me anything. You want to go? Get loans. Work more hours. It'll build character." It wasn't just about the money. It was about what it meant. That he was willing to invest in a larger house for Linda, in a new truck for Ethan, but when it came to me, suddenly he was all about self-reliance. We argued. Voices rose, accusations flew. I said things I'd been swallowing for years, about the favoritism, about feeling like a ghost in my own home. At one point, I slammed my palm on the table and shouted, "She's replaced Mom, and you can't even see it." Silence fell like a hammer. Linda's face twisted. "Get out," she hissed. "You don't talk to your father like that in my house." My father's jaw tightened, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he stood, pointed toward the stairs. "Pack a bag, Daniel. If you can't respect my family, you can't live under my roof." My family. Not our family. Not you and me. I'll never forget those words. I thought he'd cool off. That he'd come to my room later like he used to after fights and say, "You're still my boy." But he didn't. I packed what I could carry into a torn duffel bag and walked out into the rain while Linda stood in the doorway with her arms folded, a thin smile playing at her lips. Ethan watched from the upstairs window. He never called me that night. Or the next. When I tried to come by a week later to talk, my key didn't work. The locks had been changed. "Your father doesn't want to see you right now." Linda's voice came through the intercom when I pressed the doorbell. "He needs peace. You've made your choice, Daniel. Maybe in a few years, when you've grown up." The line clicked dead. I scraped through that first year on couches and cheap rentals, juggling 2 jobs and classes. It would be dramatic to say I slept under a bridge, but the truth is, I just did what a lot of kids without a safety net do. I hustled. I learned to live on ramen and coffee, to stretch a tank of gas for 2 weeks, to pretend I didn't mind when other students complained about their parents calling too much. Every once in a while, I'd see my father's face on a billboard or on a local news feature about small-town success. I'd switch the channel or look away. The hurt hardened into something else. Not hate, but a cold resignation. I told myself I didn't need him. I finished my degree. I got a job at a mid-sized marketing firm in the city. I built a life without him. But no matter how much time passed, a part of me still wanted to believe that the man who had taught me to ride a bike was still in there somewhere, buried under Linda's influence. That he missed me, even if he didn't show it. That maybe someday we'd sit down and fix what was broken. We never got that chance. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk staring at a spreadsheet that refused to make sense. My phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. "Hello." I answered, already half distracted. "Is this Daniel Walker?" A male voice asked, formal and crisp. "Yes." "Who's this?" "My name is Alan Pierce. I'm an attorney. I represented your father, Thomas Walker." There was a brief pause. "I'm sorry to tell you this over the phone, but your father passed away 2 days ago. Heart attack." For a moment, the office noise faded. My chest tightened. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Heart attack. 2 days ago. My mind snagged on the absurdity of hearing about my own father's death from a stranger. Did he suffer? I heard myself ask, my voice sounding distant. "I wasn't there," Alan said gently. "But I understand it was quick. I'm calling because Mr. Walker left a will, and there will be a formal reading at my office this Friday at 10 a.m. You're named as an interested party. I would strongly advise you to attend." Interest party. Legal words that meant nothing and everything. I wasn't exactly on speaking terms with my father, I said, the bitterness slipping out before I could stop it. "I doubt Linda wants me there." A brief, dry chuckle crackled over the line. Regardless of what your stepmother wants, you have every right to be present. And I believe your father anticipated that. He left very clear instructions. I'll email you the address. Why would he? I began, then stopped. There were 1,000 questions I wanted to ask, starting with why I was only now hearing about my father's health. But Alan's tone shifted back to professional. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Walker. I'll see you Friday. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at my darkened computer screen, my reflection vaguely visible. The last words I'd said to my father had been shouted across a kitchen table years ago. I had imagined different endings for us. None of them involved me standing in a stranger's office while a lawyer read out the sum of my father's life in bullet points. Part of me wanted to skip it, to spite Linda by not showing up, by showing that I didn't care. But another part of me, the part that had been 14 and lost his mother and clung to his father's promise, couldn't let it go. Friday morning, I found myself pulling into the underground garage of a sleek downtown building, palms sweating against the steering wheel. Alan Pierce's office was on the 12th floor, with frosted glass doors and a discreet silver plaque, Pierce and Associates. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, checked my name off a list and directed me down a hallway. I could hear voices murmuring behind a heavy wooden door before I reached it. My heart picked up its pace. When I stepped into the conference room, every head turned. The room itself was the kind of place you only saw in movies. Long polished table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. On one side sat a few men and women in suits I recognized as senior managers from the dealership. On the other side sat Linda and Ethan. Linda was dressed in black from head to toe, a slim dress that probably cost more than my rent, a string of pearls at her throat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, makeup flawless. She clutched a monogrammed handkerchief in one manicured hand, but her eyes were dry. Ethan sat beside her, broader now, his soccer player frame filling the chair. He wore a tailored navy suit and an expensive watch that caught the light when he shifted. They looked less like a grieving widow and son and more like people attending a business negotiation. Linda's lips curled when she saw me. Not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Well, she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. Look who decided to bless us with his presence. Ethan snorted under his breath. Some of the managers looked uncomfortable. One, Mr. Johnson, the old sales director, nodded at me with something like sympathy. I gave a tight nod back and took the empty chair at the far end of the table, as physically distant from Linda as I could manage. Alan Pierce sat at the head of the table, a stack of folders in front of him. He was in his 60s, with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, his suit immaculate but unshowy. He regarded me with a brief, assessing glance, then cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming, he said. As you know, we are here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Thomas Walker. Before we begin, I must remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding. Interruptions or outbursts will not be tolerated. Linda gave a little laugh. Oh, we'll behave, Alan. We all know how this is going to go anyway, don't we? Her tone was light, but the smugness underneath it was unmistakable. She had reason to be confident, at least on the surface. For years, she'd paraded around town as Mrs. Walker, the businesswoman behind the man, hosting charity galas and photo ops at the dealership. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Dad had made some changes to his estate planning after he married her. The script was common enough: second wife, golden child, estranged oldest son. I could practically see the line in the will already. To my beloved wife Linda and son Ethan, I leave. Alan didn't respond to her comment. He opened the top folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read in a monotone. The preamble, the legal declarations that my father was of sound mind when he signed, that this document revoked all previous wills and codicils. As he spoke, I watched Linda. She leaned back slightly in her chair, the picture of composed grief. But in her eyes there was something else, something sharp and gleaming. Every time Alan's droning voice rolled over a phrase like "my entire estate" or "all shares in Walker Automotive Group," the corner of her mouth twitched upward. Ethan sat with his arms folded, jaw clenched, staring straight ahead as if he were already sitting in my father's office chair. And me? I sat at the far end of the table, my own hands clenched in my lap, trying to keep my face neutral. I told myself I was here for closure, that I didn't expect or want. anything from my father. But when I heard my name for the first time, my heart still skipped. To my eldest son, Daniel Walker. Linda's eyes snapped toward me, that smirk tightening. She thought she knew exactly what came next. She thought the story was already written. To my eldest son, Daniel Walker. Every muscle in my body went tight. For half a heartbeat, hope flared, stupid and fragile. Alan continued, his tone unchanged. I hereby leave the sum of $10,000, to be paid from my liquid assets, as well as my personal watch collection, with the exception of the Patek Philippe Nautilus, which is bequeathed separately below. I make no further provision for Daniel Walker in this will, as he has chosen to live independently of this family. The words hit harder than any punch. $10,000. After a lifetime together. After building an empire side by side, even if I'd been shoved out in the end. And that little knife twist at the end, chosen to live independently of this family. As if I'd just packed a bag one day on a whim and abandoned them. As if I hadn't been forced out into the rain while Linda watched. Across the table, Linda's lips pulled upward in a smile that didn't even bother to pretend to be sympathetic. Ethan's jaw unclenched, his shoulders dropping, like some tension he'd been holding had finally been released. Well, Linda murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. That was generous. More than I would have done, honestly. My ears burned. I stared down at my hands in my lap, so I wouldn't have to look at her at anyone. I thought I'd come prepared for this, for being cut out, for being formally disowned on paper. I told myself on the drive over that I didn't care. That I had my own life, my own job, my own apartment. That whatever my father did with his money now was his business. But hearing it read aloud, listening to a stranger's voice call me out as if I'd been the one to walk away, that was different. It made everything I tried to bury rise back up, raw and stinging. Alan cleared his throat and continued. The rest, residue, and remainder of my estate, including but not limited to my primary residence at 14, Foxwood Lane, all associated furnishings and contents, my vacation property on Lake Meriden, all vehicles registered in my name, all interest, shares, and controlling stake in Walker Automotive Group, and any subsidiaries and associated investments, I leave to my beloved wife, Linda Walker, and my son, Ethan Walker, in equal shares. He paused to let that sink in, as if it was a surprise to anyone. In the event that either Linda Walker or Ethan Walker predecease me, their share shall pass to the survivor. In the event they both predecease me, such remaining assets shall be distributed to charities of my choosing, as outlined in Schedule B. He went on with more legalese, appointing Linda as executor, instructing that debts be paid, that certain charitable donations be made at Linda's discretion. It all washed over me in a dull roar. Linda sat up straighter with every line. By the time he reached the end, she'd folded her hands delicately on the table and was looking around the room like a queen addressing her court. Alan reached the last page. Signed, this 14th day of March, 2018, by Thomas Walker. In the presence of the undersigned witnesses, he read the witness statements, then closed the folder with a soft thump. That concludes the reading of Mr. Walker's last will and testament, he said. If there are any questions, I will answer what I can within the bounds of attorney-client privilege. For a moment, no one spoke. Then all the little sounds came rushing back at once. The rustle of papers, the scrape of chairs, a muffled cough. One of the managers, Mr. Johnson, shifted awkwardly. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, but Linda got there first. Well, I suppose that's that, she said brightly, dabbing the corner of her eye with her handkerchief in a performance of decorum. Tom was a practical man. He always knew what was best for the business. Didn't he, Ethan? Ethan nodded, a tight, satisfied smile on his face. Yeah, Dad knew who really had his back. I felt my fingernails biting into my palms. I wanted to throw something, to stand up and shout the truth, that I had been there long before Linda ever set foot on the lot, that I'd washed cars and swept floors and learned how to read sales contracts at that same kitchen table where he'd told me to pack my bags. That I had his eyes and his stubborn chin and years' worth of memories they would never be able to touch. But what was the point? My father's betrayal had already been formalized, notarized, sealed. Nothing I said in that room would change the ink on those pages. So I swallowed it. Congratulations, I said, forcing my voice to stay level. You got what you wanted. Linda tilted her head, feigning confusion. Oh, Daniel, this isn't about what I wanted. It's about what your father decided. You heard him. You chose to live independently. You made your bed, dear. Her choice of words, dear, was the same one she'd used when I was 17 and she'd accidentally thrown away the box of my mother's books because they were old and dusty. Like a pat on the head and a slap in the face rolled into one. Ethan stood up, sliding his chair back with a screech. Come on, Mom. We have a lot to do. We certainly do. Linda gathered her oversized leather handbag, already mentally rearranging my father's house in her mind, no doubt. She turned to Alan. Email me the full inventory. I need to know what I'm working with. Of course, Mrs. Walker, Alan said neutrally. People began to filter out. A few of the managers gave me quick, sympathetic nods or muttered awkward condolences. I mumbled something back, barely hearing myself. I just wanted out of that room, away from Linda's perfume, from Ethan's cologne, from the embossed folders that seemed to radiate my father's absence. I stood, intending to slip out behind the last of them, when Alan's voice stopped me. Daniel, could you stay for a moment, please? I hesitated. Linda paused at the doorway, eyebrow arching. Is there a problem, Alan? She asked, an edge under the sweetness. No problem, he said smoothly. I just have some additional documents that pertain specifically to Daniel's bequest. You're free to go, Mrs. Walker. I'll follow up with you this afternoon. Something flickered through her expression. Suspicion? Annoyance? It was gone as quickly as it came. Very well, she said. Come along, Ethan. They swept out, their voices echoing down the hall, already talking about transition plans and public statements. The door clicked shut. Silence settled. I turned back to Alan, stuffing my hands into my pockets to hide the slight tremor. If this is about the watch collection, you can just mail them, I said. I don't exactly need a box of reminders. Alan studied me for a moment, his gaze sharper now that the audience was gone. Sit down, Daniel. Something in his tone made me obey without thinking. I lowered myself back into the chair. The conference room felt suddenly larger, emptier. I want to offer my condolences, he began, and this time it didn't sound like a line. Whatever happened between you and your father, losing a parent is never simple. I gave a short, humorless laugh. You don't know the half of it. He leaned back slightly. Actually, I know a bit more than you might think. I frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Alan steepled his fingers. What we read just now is, indeed, a last will and testament signed by Thomas Walker in 2018. It is valid. It reflects the estate plan he put in place shortly after marrying Linda. However, he let the word hang in the air. However what? I prompted. He reached into his inside jacket pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished key. He turned in his chair to face a low credenza behind him, then slid open the middle drawer. Inside, I glimpsed neat rows of file folders, a locked metal box, and an old leather envelope. Alan inserted the key into the box's tiny lock, twisted, and lifted the lid. From it, he took out a thin, sealed envelope with my father's unmistakable handwriting on the front. However, he said quietly, placing the envelope on the table between us, that was not the last change your father made. The room seemed to tilt for a second. My eyes locked on the envelope, on the way the ink had bled slightly along the curves of certain letters. Thomas Walker. That was his hand. I'd watched him sign checks, contracts, Christmas cards with that same slanted script my whole life. What is that? I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. This, Alan said, tapping it with one finger, is a later document, dated 6 months ago. It revokes the 2018 will we just read and replaces it. I stared at him, trying to process his words. You mean there's another will? Why didn't you? I stopped, realizing my voice was rising. Alan held up a calming hand. Your father gave me very specific instructions on how he wanted this handled. He asked that we read the 2018 will first, in the presence of all existing beneficiaries and key stakeholders, so there was no question about what Linda and Ethan believed the situation to be. Only after that, and only with you present, was I to reveal this. It was such a Thomas Walker move that for a moment all I could do was sit there, half stunned, half impressed. The man had always loved a dramatic reveal. At Christmas, he was the type to hide the real present behind the tree after you'd already opened 3 decoys. But this wasn't a new bike or a surprise vacation. This was his entire life's work. Why? I whispered. Why would he do it this way? Alan's gaze softened. Because he wanted you to hear, in his own words, both what he'd once decided and what he later came to regret. Regret. The word sat between us like a living thing. For years, I told myself my father felt none, that he slept just fine in that big house while I counted out tips to pay rent. But here was an envelope that said otherwise. Why didn't he tell me himself? I asked, the old hurt bubbling up. Why didn't he call? Show up? Anything. Alan let out a slow breath. Do you remember about a year ago, when he came to see you? At your apartment? I blinked. My mind stumbled back through blurred months, work deadlines, overdue notices, the gray routine of city life. And then I found it. That one evening I tried so hard not to think about. It had been a Tuesday. I'd just come off a 12-hour day, my shirt stained with coffee, my feet aching. I'd been microwaving leftovers when there was a knock at my door. I'd opened it expecting a delivery guy, or maybe my landlord. Instead, my father had been standing there in the hallway, holding a six-pack of the beer he used to drink on Sunday football days. He'd looked smaller, older. The swagger he wore at the dealership, the booming laugh, were gone. His hair had more gray in it. There were deep lines around his eyes I didn't recognize. Hey, kiddo, he'd said, tentative, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to call me that anymore. I just stood there, fingers clenched around the doorknob. Every instinct had screamed to slam it in his face, to tell him to go back to his real family. Instead, I'd stepped aside. We'd sat on my second-hand couch in awkward silence while the TV murmured mindlessly in the background. He'd asked about my job in that too bright, too formal tone people use with strangers. I'd asked about Ethan to fill the air. He's doing great, Dad had said, eyes lighting up. Running more of the day-to-day now. Got a real head for it. He'd hesitated, then added, You would have made a hell of a manager too, you know. Always said that. Did you? I'd shot back before I could stop myself. He'd flinched. The beer bottle in his hand had creaked under his grip. Look, Daniel, I know things got out of hand. I let your stepmother influence me more than I should have. I wasn't there for you when you needed me to be. I'm not asking you to forgive me, not tonight. I just wanted to see you. To say I'm proud of you, son. I'd scoffed. Proud of what? That I learned how to survive after you kicked me out? That I build a life that doesn't include you? His eyes had gone glassy. For a second, I thought he might cry. Thomas Walker didn't cry. I deserve that, he'd said quietly. I do. But I promise you, Daniel, I'm going to fix this. Maybe not everything, but something. You might not believe that right now. Hell, I don't even know if you'll ever see it. But I can't leave things the way they are. Before I could figure out what to say to that, his phone had buzzed. Linda's name had lit up the screen. His mouth had tightened. I have to go, he'd said, standing up too quickly. She doesn't like when I'm out late. That last part had slipped out with a bitterness I wasn't used to hearing in his voice. He'd paused in the doorway, looking back at me like he wanted to say 1,000 more things. Then he'd just said, I love you, kiddo, and left. I'd watched him get into his car from my window, shadows stretching long under the streetlights. He'd sat there for a long moment, hands on the wheel, before driving off. After that, nothing. No follow-up. No calls. I'd written it off as a moment of guilt, quickly reabsorbed into Linda's orbit. Now, sitting in Alan's office, I realized that wasn't the whole story. He mentioned coming to see you, Alan said softly, bringing me back. He came to me the next day, told me he'd made a grave mistake 5 years earlier when he let his anger and his new wife dictate his estate planning. He said he couldn't look at himself in the mirror knowing his eldest son would be written out of everything he'd built. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry. So he rewrote it. I whispered, Yes. Alan tapped the envelope again. This was executed, witnessed, and notarized in my presence. Thomas was perfectly lucid. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he insisted I keep it under lock and key, separate from his prior documents. He knew Linda would pressure him to see the paperwork, to be involved. He didn't want her to know. A laugh escaped me, broken and disbelieving. She's going to lose her mind. Alan's mouth twitched. I imagine so. That's partly why he wanted it done this way. Not just for dramatic effect, but to ensure there was no opportunity for her to interfere. I stared at the envelope, at my father's hand, at the thing that could potentially upend everything Linda and Ethan thought they'd just secured. What does it say? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Alan didn't reach for it. Not yet. We're not opening this in private. he said. That wouldn't be right. Your father was very clear. This is to be read in the presence of all principal beneficiaries. Linda, Ethan, you, the senior management. He wanted witnesses. He wanted it on record. He slid the envelope back toward himself and tucked it into the open metal box, leaving the lid unlatched this time. The symbolic weight of that tiny movement sunk in. So what now? I asked. Now, he said, standing. We ask Mrs. Walker and Ethan to rejoin us. And we do as your father instructed. A strange calm settled over me. A sense that, for the first time in years, I wasn't the one being dragged behind other people's decisions. That for once, Linda and Ethan were about to be the ones blindsided. Alan walked to the door and opened it. The hum of the outer office drifted in. Phones ringing, low conversations. He spoke briefly to the receptionist, then closed the door again. We sat in silence for a minute or two that felt like an hour. My heart thudded steadily, but the rawness from earlier had transformed into something else, a focused, almost cold anticipation. The door swung open. Linda swept back in, Ethan on her heels, annoyance etched across both their faces. What is this about, Alan? She demanded, her sweetness from earlier gone. We have a lot to handle. The funeral, the press, the staff. You said we were done. Alan resumed his seat at the head of the table, folding his hands calmly. I understand and appreciate that, Mrs. Walker, he said. This won't take long. However, there is one more document your husband left in my care that must be read into the record. Linda blinked. Another document? What are you talking about? Ethan frowned. I thought that was the will. Alan met their eyes steadily. It was a will, he said. But it was not the last will your husband signed. The color drained from Linda's face. Ethan's jaw tightened. What do you mean, not the last? Linda's voice was sharp now, the veneer cracking. Tom and I handled all of our estate planning together back in 2018. I was there. I know what we signed. I'm sure you do, Alan said mildly. However, Mr. Walker revised his estate plan 6 months ago. That revision was executed in this office, without your presence, and supersedes the document we have just read. As his attorney, it is my duty to present the most recent valid will. He reached back to the credenza, lifted the metal box, and set it on the table. The tiny lock hung open. Linda stared at it, as if it were a snake. You're lying, she whispered. Tom would never. He would have told me. Alan's eyes were kind, but unyielding. I have no interest in deceiving anyone, Mrs. Walker. My loyalty is to my client and to the law. Your husband anticipated that this might be difficult for you to accept. That's why he insisted Daniel be here today, and why he left very clear, written instructions for me. He slid the envelope out, the one with my father's handwriting on the front, and placed it in the center of the table. Shall we proceed? He asked quietly. Linda's hand flew to her chest. Ethan leaned forward, eyes narrowed. I sat perfectly still, staring at that thin slice of paper that had the power to turn their smirks into something else entirely. In that moment, for the first time since I was thrown out of my father's house, I felt the balance begin to shift. Alan slit the envelope open with a small silver letter opener. The sound of paper tearing seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly airless room. He unfolded the pages slowly, laid them flat, and adjusted his glasses. For a heartbeat, he just looked at the words, as if honoring the man who'd written them. Then he began. I, Thomas Walker, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all prior wills and codicils, including but not limited to the document executed on the 14th day of March, 2018, and do publish and declare this to be my last will and testament. Linda made a sharp, strangled sound. He what? Ethan muttered. No way, under his breath. Alan kept reading. To my beloved wife, Linda Walker, he read, voice even. I leave the sum of $50,000, to be paid out of my liquid assets within 6 months of my death. I also leave her the right to occupy our primary residence at 14 Foxwood Lane for a period of 12 months following my death, provided she pays all utilities and upkeep during that time. I make no further provision for Linda in this will, as she is capable of providing for herself and has enjoyed the benefit of our shared lifestyle for many years. Color drained from Linda's face, then rushed back in a mottled red. 50,000, she choked. A year in the house? That's it. She slapped the table. That's less than what we spend in 6 months. Alan didn't look up. To my son, Ethan Walker, he continued steadily, I leave the sum of $50,000, to be paid out of my liquid assets within 12 months of my death, conditional upon his completion of an accredited vocational or academic program within 5 years of my passing. If he fails to do so, Ethan's share shall be added to the trust described below. Ethan shot to his feet. What the hell, man? He snapped. Conditional? He doesn't get to lecture me from the grave. I've been running his damn business for 2 years. Sit down, Linda hissed, clawing at his sleeve. We don't say another word without a lawyer. Alan's voice didn't waver. To my eldest son, Daniel Walker, he read, and this time my name didn't come with a caveat about my independence. I leave the remainder and residue of my entire estate, of whatever nature and wherever situated, including but not limited to my primary residence at 14, Foxwood Lane, my vacation property on Lake Meriden, all vehicles registered in my name, all interests, shares, and controlling stake in Walker Automotive Group and related entities, all retirement accounts, investments, and life insurance proceeds, and any other property not otherwise specifically bequeathed. My heart stopped, then hammered so hard I could hear blood in my ears. To Daniel, I leave these things, Alan read on, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. He is my firstborn son. He worked beside me in the early days when no one else would. I wronged him deeply when I allowed my anger and pride to be manipulated by my second wife. I have watched from a distance as he built a life with no help from me. This is my attempt, however insufficient, to make that right. The room fell silent. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. For a second, I wasn't in that conference room anymore. I was 13 again, standing in the lot behind the dealership while my dad handed me a set of keys and said, grinning, "You and me, kiddo. We're gonna build something." Except now, there was a lifetime of damage between then and now, and a legal document trying to bridge it. Linda shattered the silence. "This is a fraud," she hissed, lunging toward the table. She grabbed at the pages, but Alan's hand came down hard, pinning them in place with surprising strength for a man his age. "Do not touch my client's documents, Mrs. Walker," he said sharply. She glared at him, breathing hard. "Tom would never do this. Never. You must have coerced him. He wasn't well. He wasn't thinking straight. Your husband passed every capacity test we are required to conduct," Alan cut in. "There are medical records on file. Evaluations. He knew exactly what he was doing. And he did it 6 months ago. If you doubt that, you are free to petition the probate court. But I would caution you to consider that any such challenge will open up all of your conduct to scrutiny. There. Just a hint of steel under the professionalism." I looked at him sharply. All of her conduct. Alan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas had concerns," he said quietly, eyes flicking toward me. "We discussed them at length." Linda laughed, high and brittle. "Concerns? About what, Alan?" "That I spent money on keeping up our home, on supporting his son. I did everything for that man. Everything. While this ungrateful brat," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "ran off to play poor." The lie was so blatant I almost laughed. "Kicked out is a little different than ran off," I said, my voice cold. "But sure. Let's rewrite history again." Ethan slammed his fist on the table. "Screw this," he snapped. "We're contesting. Right, Mom? We're not just gonna let this loser waltz in and take everything." Linda straightened, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Of course we are," she said. "Alan, you haven't heard the last of this. I will have my lawyers all over you. There's no way some secret piece of paper suddenly erases the will Tom and I made together. We had an agreement. Your husband had an estate plan," Alan corrected. "He was free to change it at any time, with or without your input. That is the law. I have fulfilled my duty by reading his final instructions to all of you. What you do next is your choice. Just be aware that Thomas anticipated you might respond this way. He prepared for it." Linda's eyes flickered, uncertainty seeping in around the fury. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Alan closed the file and clasped his hands on top of it. "It means there are additional documents," he said. "Declarations, recordings, witness statements." He left a detailed account of the circumstances that led to his decision. "If you wish to challenge him in court, all of it will become public record." Something in her posture changed at the word recordings. A barely perceptible flinch. Ethan glanced at her, confusion flickering across his face. "Recordings of what?" Ethan asked, Dad and who? Alan's gaze moved from Linda to Ethan and back again. I am not at liberty to discuss the contents without a formal proceeding, he said. But I would advise you both to consult counsel before taking any steps you can't undo. Linda's mouth opened, then snapped shut. I could almost see the wheels turning behind her eyes. For years, she'd been queen of that house, of that business. She'd yelled, manipulated, belittled anyone who got in her way, including my father. Maybe she hadn't considered that one day. Someone might have been listening. Alan turned to me. Daniel, as primary beneficiary under this will, you will need to decide whether to initiate probate immediately or allow some time for potential settlements. My office will guide you through either path. It took me a beat to realize he was waiting for my input. For years, I'd been shut out of every decision, every conversation. Now, suddenly, the word "you" was attached to things like initiate probate. My voice came out hoarse. I cleared my throat. I want to follow my father's instructions. All of them. Whatever he documented, I want it on the record. No more secrets. Alan nodded once, as if he'd expected that. Linda pushed back her chair so hard it screeched. Fine, she spat. You think you've won, Daniel? You think this makes up for anything? We'll see what a judge has to say. And don't you dare set foot in that house. I'm not moving a single inch until the court tells me to. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, Ethan on her heels. For a long moment after the door slammed, I just sat there, staring at the grain of the table. My whole life had just been yanked sideways twice in the span of an hour. Disowned, then reinstated. Cut out, then put at the center. It was dizzying. How are you feeling? Alan asked quietly. I laughed, the sound hollow. I don't even know. Angry. Relieved. Sick. All of it, I guess. He nodded. That's normal. You don't have to decide everything today. We'll take it step by step. He slid a copy of the new will toward me. My name was there, in black and white, not as a footnote, but as the focus. I wish he'd told me, I murmured. I wish we'd had more than one beer on my couch and a promise to fix things. Alan's expression softened. He was a proud man, he said. It was hard for him to admit he'd been wrong. But he did the one thing he knew how to do. He used the tools at his disposal. Legal documents. Money. He left you what he could. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I guess this is my chance to do better with it than he did. Linda made good on her threat to contest, of course. Within a week, a thick packet arrived from her attorneys, alleging undue influence, lack of capacity, and suspicious circumstances around the execution of the new will. They painted me as the manipulative, estranged son swooping in at the end to twist a vulnerable old man away from his loving wife and loyal stepson. If I hadn't lived the last 15 years, maybe someone would have believed it. But my father hadn't gone into this blind. The additional documents Alan mentioned turned out to be more than just a letter of regret. There were emails my father had printed and saved, Linda berating him for wasting money on donations instead of taking care of family, Linda pushing him to sign things without reading them because Alan is overcautious. There were bank statements showing large transfers from joint accounts to an account solely in Linda's name, marked as household, but that, under scrutiny, lined up neatly with luxury purchases and unexplained cash withdrawals. There were notes from his doctor, attesting to his mental clarity at the time he signed the new will. There was a written narrative, several pages long, in his own words, about the night he kicked me out, about the guilt that had gnawed at him since, about the growing realization that Linda had slowly isolated him from me, deleting messages, forgetting to tell him I'd called, even intercepting birthday cards I'd sent in those first, fumbling years. And then there were the recordings. He'd started using a small digital recorder in his pocket when Linda thought she was chewing him out in private. Her voice played tinny and sharp in the courtroom during the probate hearing. You're not changing a damn thing, Tom. Do you hear me? Everything we built is for Ethan. That boy earned it. Daniel? He's nothing. He couldn't even hack it under his own roof. You're not leaving him a cent, you old fool. I won't allow it. My father's voice, quiet. He's my son. Ethan is your son now, she snapped. Grow up. Sitting at the petitioner's table in the cramped county probate courtroom, listening to that, was like being hit with cold water and fire at the same time. I shouldn't have needed audio proof to believe what I'd lived, but hearing it laid bare stripped away the last of any doubt about who'd been pulling strings. Linda's attorney tried to argue context, tried to spin it as marital disagreement, as normal tension in a blended family. The judge, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and no patience for theatrics, wasn't buying it. "Mrs. Walker," she said during Linda's testimony, steepling her fingers, "you claim your husband was too ill to understand what he was signing. Yet here we have his physician attesting otherwise, your own emails acknowledging his sharpness, and, frankly, your recorded acknowledgement that you were attempting to control his estate decisions. Can you explain that?" Linda's smile, brittle under the fluorescent lights. "You have to understand, Your Honor, Tom could be impulsive. He needed me to temper his decisions. He was too generous, especially with Daniel, who never appreciated anything." "So your intervention was for his own good?" the judge asked. "Of course," Linda said, tears welling in practiced fashion. "I love my husband. Everything I did was to protect him. And yet," the judge said slowly, flipping through the file, "it appears you moved significant funds into accounts solely in your name without his knowledge, pressured him to include your son Ethan as an equal heir to a business he'd spent decades building before either of you entered his life, and repeatedly referred to his eldest son as, quote, nothing, unquote. Forgive me if I have difficulty reconciling that with your stated motive of protection." For once, Linda had no ready answer. Ethan, when called to testify, fared no better. He tried to sound authoritative, talking about all the sacrifices he'd made for the dealership, how he'd kept it running in the last 2 years, but under cross-examination, it became clear that most of his responsibilities had been delegated to long-serving managers. He couldn't answer basic questions about profit margins, inventory turnover, or even the terms of their main supplier contracts. "So when you say you ran the business," Alan's co-counsel asked dryly, "what did you actually do, Mr. Walker?" Ethan's face flushed. "I coordinated things," he muttered. "I was the public face." "Meaning you showed up to cut ribbons and take photos?" the attorney pressed. Ethan glared. "You don't know what you're talking about." The judge did, though. By the time testimony ended, it was obvious to anyone watching that Linda and Ethan's narrative of the devoted second family wronged by a scheming, estranged son didn't hold water. The judge's ruling, when it came 3 weeks later, was blunt. "I find that the will dated 6 months prior to Mr. Walker's death was executed validly, with full capacity, and that there is insufficient evidence to support any claim of undue influence by Daniel Walker or anyone else in its creation," she said. "On the contrary, the evidence suggests a pattern of attempted undue influence by Linda Walker in relation to the previous 2018 will. The 2018 document is hereby set aside. The later will shall be admitted to probate and executed as written." Linda let out a little sound like air escaping a balloon. Ethan swore under his breath. I sat there, hands clenched on my knees, feeling not victorious exactly, just released. Like a door I'd been pounding on for years had finally swung open of its own weight. The judge wasn't done. "As to the occupancy provision," she continued, turning to Linda, "you will have 12 months from the date of this order to vacate 14 Foxwood Lane, as your late husband specified. During that time, you are responsible for all utilities and maintenance. You will receive the lump sum bequest outlined in the will and no more. You are free to seek employment or alternative arrangements." Linda's mouth opened. 12 months? Where am I supposed to go? The judge's expression didn't soften. "You are an able-bodied adult, Mrs. Walker. The court is not in the business of lifelong support for those who have already benefited considerably from the decedent's assets. This is not an alimony hearing. It is a probate matter." Ethan's share was upheld as written, conditional on his completion of some form of schooling. He muttered something about not needing charity, but even he seemed to understand arguing further would only dig the hole deeper. When the hearing adjourned, reporters waiting in the hallway swarmed, small-town media eager to turn the fall of the Walker dynasty into a human interest piece. Linda shoved through them, sunglasses on indoors, barking no comment. Ethan trailed after her, jaw clenched, shoulders tight. I slipped out a side door with Alan, ducking the cameras. Outside, in the gray parking lot, I leaned back against my car and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since I was 18. "It's over," I said softly. Alan nodded. "The legal part, yes. The rest, that's up to you." Taking control of Walker Automotive Group was surreal. On paper, it meant I suddenly owned a majority stake in a business valued in the tens of millions. In reality, It meant a lot of awkward meetings with managers who remembered me as the boss's kid washing cars in the summer, who had watched me disappear and then watched Linda and Ethan fill the void. The first day I walked into the dealership not as a discarded son, but as owner. The showroom looked exactly as I remembered. Bright lights, gleaming paint, that faint smell of rubber and coffee. The only difference was the giant framed photo of my father and Ethan shaking hands that hung behind the reception desk. I stood in front of it for a long moment. Then I turned to the receptionist. "We're going to take that down," I said. "And we're going to put up a photo of everyone. All the people who actually keep this place running." She blinked, then smiled. "Yes, sir. I didn't fire Ethan. I could have. A petty part of me wanted to. But my father hadn't cut him off entirely, despite everything, and I didn't want to mimic the worst of his choices. Instead, I called Ethan into my new office, my father's old office, and laid it out. "You have a place here if you want it," I said. "On the same terms as anyone else. No special treatment. No title you haven't earned. You start in sales. You work your way up, or you don't. It's your call." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "You think I'm going to work for you?" he snarled. I met his glare evenly. "I think you need to decide whether you want to build something on your own merits or keep blaming everyone else for what you don't have. I'm giving you a choice I never got." He left without answering. A week later, I got an email from HR. Ethan had declined the offer and cleared out his company locker. I heard through the grapevine he moved to another state with some savings Linda scraped together from selling jewelry and designer bags. We haven't spoken since. Linda lasted almost the full 12 months in the house. For a while, she tried to maintain appearances, hosting smaller gatherings, posting curated photos on social media that made it look like nothing had changed. But as the trust fund mothers stopped returning her calls and the charity committees quietly replaced her, the cracks showed. On the last day of her occupancy period, I drove out to Foxwood Lane. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less like a fortress, more like an aging structure that had seen too many storms. Movers were hauling out the last of Linda's furniture. The big SUV she'd once paraded through town was gone. She was standing in the yard, supervising, when I pulled up. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the grass. "You here to gloat?" she asked finally, her voice rougher, the edges ground down. I shook my head. "No, I'm here to make sure the property's secure. That's all." She laughed bitterly. "Secure. Right. Wouldn't want the gold-digging stepmother sneaking back in and stealing the silverware." I thought of the recordings, the bank statements, the look on her face when she first heard my father's words in the courtroom. I thought of the 14-year-old kid I'd been, desperate for any scrap of maternal warmth, and how she'd turned that need into a weapon. "I'm not going to waste more of my life hating you," I said quietly. "You did what you did. My father did what he did. I have to live with that. So do you." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For once, she had no comeback. As I turned to go inside, she spoke again, softer. "He loved you, you know," she said. "Even when he was mad. Even when he pretended he didn't." It drove me crazy. I paused, my back to her. "I know," I said. "He finally found a way to show it." After she left, I walked through the empty rooms. My mother's laugh seemed to echo in the kitchen, faint and far away. In my old bedroom, the one that had been taken over by Ethan's trophies and posters for years, the walls were bare again. I sat on the floor in the corner where my bed used to be and let myself grieve, properly, for everything that might have been. In my father's den, behind the desk, I found one more envelope with my name on it. No lawyers this time. No notarizations. Just his handwriting. "Daniel," it read. "If you're reading this, it means Alan did what I asked. I chickened out, kiddo. I should have said this to your face. I'm sorry. For that night. For every birthday I missed. For every time I let someone tell me you didn't matter as much as their comfort. I can't undo the years. All I can do is give you the tools to build something better. Don't make my mistakes. Don't let pride cost you your son someday. Love, Dad." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my wallet behind my ID. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Months passed. The dealership stabilized. We restructured, brought in new training, started a scholarship in my father's name for kids who'd worked there part-time and wanted to go to school. I kept my apartment in the city. I didn't move into Foxwood Lane. I couldn't. Too many ghosts. Instead, I rented it out for a while, then eventually sold it and used part of the proceeds to buy a modest house on the edge of town with a small backyard. On summer evenings, I'd sit out there and listen to the buzz of cicadas, watch the sun slip behind the trees, and think about how loud silence can be after years of chaos. People in town still point sometimes. Some still see me as the estranged son who came back rich. Others see the guy who won against his stepmother. I can't control their stories. I only know mine. I used to think revenge would feel like fireworks, like a big, satisfying explosion. It didn't. It felt like paperwork and courtrooms and long, exhausting conversations. The real victory wasn't watching Linda's smirk crumble when the second will came out of that drawer, though I won't pretend that wasn't cathartic. The real victory was walking into my father's old business and making it a place where no kid would ever be told they didn't belong, where no one's value would be measured by who they shared a last name with or what picture hung behind the front desk. The real victory was learning to live with the complicated truth that my father hurt me badly, that he was manipulated, that he was also, in the end, a man trying, in his own flawed way, to make amends. He left a second will locked in a drawer. I had a choice what to do with it. I chose to open it, to face everything that came after, to build something different from the ruins he left me. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that paper carries power, contracts, wills, agreements. But in the end, the real legacy we leave behind isn't written in legalese. It's written in how we treat each other when no one is watching. It's written in the kids we raise, in the apologies we make, in the courage it takes to say, I was wrong. My stepmother will probably never say those words. My father only managed to in ink. I intend to say them out loud someday, if I ever have a child standing across from me with hurt in their eyes. Until then, I keep my grandfather's old screwdriver in my desk at the dealership and my father's letter in my wallet, and I try, every day, to remember the boy on the asphalt lot and the man in the conference room and the space between them. That space is where justice finally found me.